Good morning, Etienne. Today, what we are doing is we are looking at our new topic. So it's not really new because we are just refreshing our memory um, on what we know of the Western Front section of the course. So you would have just completed section B of paper one, which is medicine. So well done. And now we're going to look back to section A, which we did in um, year nine last year, September to December. And really, what we're going to be doing over the next few sessions is we're going to be looking at the skills that we need for Section A. And hopefully, you remember that the skills that I'm looking at and I'm thinking about are the questions being a describe the features of question, which is what we're going to practice today, a how useful questions, where we use two pivotal paragraphs, and then a follow up question, which we're going to do next session. So, for today, what we're going to do, I'm going to just talk you briefly about the content of today's lesson, but mainly our sessions are running on skills, so it's all going to be about skills. What we're doing today is we're looking at the trench system. Now, in front of you now, you have a knowledge grid. Now, the knowledge grid, well, the first half of it anyway, is relevant to us for this session because it talks about the different parts of the trench system. To give you a better look at it, I've put up two diagrams on the board here, on your screen, sorry. Now the trench system, I'll talk about this diagram first of all. Let's imagine over here in this gap here is no man's land. And you've got enemy trenches on this side, and this is the Western Front trenches. Firstly, we have our frontline trench. Now it says here, we've got some information, so I'm going to keep referring back to both this diagram, but looking at this one too. This is where attacks would be made from. It's the firing line, the trench nearest the enemy, separated from their enemy by no man's land. Soldiers spent 50% of their time in the front line. Now this frontline trench is situated here, and obviously it makes sense that this is where the fighting would happen. Now behind this trench we have the support trench. So over here, directly behind it, you have what is called the support trench. And it talks about the fact that it's 80 meters behind the frontline trench, and people would retreat here if the frontline trench came under attack, which is natural. Obviously, if you think about it, this is the supporting trench, so it'd be the secondary trench in which people would retreat in. Again, if you have a look, you'll be able to find some more information about this trench. Now, behind that trench, you have the reserve trench. Now, reserve normally means last, and this is exactly what's the case here. It's a trench 100 meters behind the support trench, and this was where they could mobilize for counterattack. So they could start to prepare if the frontline trench was suddenly taken over by the enemy. So you have to imagine it like a process. If the enemy was to get into the frontline trench, naturally the soldiers of this trench would move backwards and backwards. You also have something called dugouts on the side over here, where men could take protective cover. Over here, you've also got certain services. So over here, we're talking about latrines, which are toilets, and you'd find equipment there. Now, throughout the trenches, you'll be able to see that there are these big, big holes, and there's a picture for you over here. Now, these are called shell holes. Now, if you went to Belgium last year, your person who was with you would have shown you those really, really big holes that were full of water. So for when the group that went with me, full of water. And that's exactly what it would have been like. And that's when shells would have made these big holes. And that would have littered the entire trench system. You can imagine that's what's all over no man's land, along with barbed wire. And no man land being a strip of land that separates the two trenches. Now, today we are looking at the trenches, but we're focusing on the conditions of the trenches. We're thinking about what the trenches are like that would make what can we tell about the trenches from two sources. Now I also want you to draw your attention to its angles. And if you see, it's in these kind of right angled sort of directions. And the whole point of that is to stop, protect the soldiers from shell blasts and stop the enemy moving along the trenches quickly if they were to, attack and take over. It's a defense sort of system. And that's called traverses, these right angles. Now what you have to do today, so I'm just going to switch to our form. You are answering 6 questions Now, the first one is describe the main feature of the frontline trench. Now, using the information I've just said in the two diagrams, all you have to do is give me one sentence that tells you about the features of the system, of the frontline trench, sorry, and one supporting sentence that develops that. So you just have to think about what you can see in the trenches, the frontline trench particularly. You know, what is it like? What happens there? How is it built in a way that can happen there? And the information can help you do that. After you finish that, you're then moving on to our first source, so source A. And all you have to do is make an inference about the conditions of the trenches. So based on this picture alone, if you knew nothing about the trenches, we didn't do it in year 9, this is the first thing that you see, and I say to you, well, what can you infer about the conditions of the trenches? I just want you to write down what you think. So you'd write down, from source A, I can infer, or source A suggests, and you'd write down your answer, what you can tell about the conditions of the trenches, so what the trenches are actually like. After you finish that, you're going to focus on the provenance. Now, the provenance of the source, now hopefully you remember, but the provenance of the source is either the nature of the source, the origin of the source, or the purpose of the source. Now, every source has a provenance. Nature is, what is it? Origin is who and when, and purpose is why. So looking at this source, what is the nature of the source? You don't need to answer that because I've actually given it to you. It's a photograph. And the question here asks you, the nature of the source is a photograph. How does the nature of the source, the fact that it's a photograph, make the source useful in telling us about the conditions of the trenches? Why is that source useful? The fact that it's a photograph, why is that more useful than, let's say, someone's drawing? Because that would be a nature too, or a letter. Why might this be particularly useful? And I just want you to answer why you think a photograph makes it useful in telling us about the conditions of the trenches. After you finish that, you can do the same thing with source B. You're going to read through source B and tell me, what can you tell about the trenches based on what you've read? Now, to help you out, on the screen, I have put up my annotations of the source. So the green is the content of the source. So what is it? What can you tell based on what the source is saying? And the blue is the provenance, the nature, the origin, or the purpose, or maybe a few. So in terms of that question, you need to think, well, what can you learn about the source based on what it's saying? Now on your screen now, you've got some green highlighted areas which can draw your attention to things you may learn about the conditions of the trenches. Therefore, you can make them, that's an inference. You can decide based on that piece of information, what can you tell about the trenches? What's the condition of the trenches like? Is it particularly hard? Is it easy? Is it dirty? Is it sanitary? Have a think and try to make an inference. After you finish that, do the same thing. I gave you a provenance of source B. So in source B, the origin, so who wrote it, or who said this, of the source is Lieutenant Charles Carrington. A lieutenant is a title, a rank in the army. Why does his job role, so being in the army, make the source useful for an inquiry into the trench conditions? Why the fact that he's in the army as a lieutenant, doesn't have to be particularly because he's a lieutenant, but the fact that he's a soldier, why does that make this source useful in telling you about the conditions of the trenches? Why is he more useful to you than, let's say, me just telling you now as a history teacher in 2021? Or more useful than a news reporter in 1916 telling you about the trench conditions? Why is he particularly useful to us? And the last thing that we're going to do is one question in which you are going to write a paragraph. Now over here, you have a model paragraph. The question you are answering is, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the conditions of the trenches for soldiers fighting on the Western Front? Source A is done for you. You have to do source B. Now, the colours represent a particular part in the Pipral paragraph. the red being point, the green being an inference, the blue being provenance, the purple being knowledge, and the orange or yellow being link. What you have to do is follow this similar structure to write down an answer for source B. And you'll be able to see that all I'm doing here is answering why that source, so why our initial source, this one, is useful in telling me about the conditions of the trenches. I focus on the content of the source first, so what I can learn based on what's in the source. Then I focus on the provenance, so the fact that it's a photograph, the nature of it, and why that's useful. Then I put in some relevant knowledge to explain, to either support, the source in explaining the conditions of the trench or dispute it. And in this case, I talk about the idea of the traverses making the movement hard, the European weather, and the waterlogged soil. You can put in that knowledge based on the diagrams and the knowledge that you know of the trenches, or use the knowledge grids to help you. After you've read through the model source, all you have to do is, following the structure, so I've also put it in here for you in red, use this source and tell me why this source is useful in telling me about the conditions of the trenches. So again, you'd be using the red sentence starter, so everyone's is going to start with source B is useful for an inquiry into the conditions of the trenches of the Western Front, because. And you're going to tell me, what does that source actually tell you? Because as you read it, it's going to tell you things about the conditions of the trenches, so what the trenches are like, and then you're literally just going to write that as your point. You're then going to pick a quote for your example. So for example, in the source, and pick a quote and make an inference based on that quote about what it was like. You're then going to tell me, you could do another inference if you'd want to, if you're trying to push yourself. You could do 2 inferences. You're then going to tell me why the provenance makes it useful, so using question 5 to help you. Put in some relevant knowledge, like we just spoke about, and then using the wording of the question, really make sure that you are linking back to the question. And that's it. You would have done a pivotal paragraph. Again, if you need help, you look at this one to help you structure your answer. If you need any help, email your class teacher, or you can email myself. Thank you. Bye.